The past, our history, is a present to us, and we should steward it well. If we don't steward it well, if we don't understand what we've been given, and we don't understand the price that has been paid, we're never going to appreciate it well enough to pass it on either. And this is one of my burdens in doing all of this, is to examine, to appreciate, and firm up our conviction for Christian education.
This is the Doc School Leader Podcast, and I'm your host, Kyler Martin. We're here to sustain the vision and support the work of faithful, courageous school leaders. Thanks for joining us. It's easy to forget that the Christian school movement is not all that old. Some of the founders still live among us. On the other hand, when we stop to count it up, we're somewhere close to the transition to the third or fourth generation of school leaders. The point is, we're far enough along to be in the range when it's common to forget and lose. Ken Kauffman cares deeply about stewarding what we have received. He brings long experience in the world of Christian education. In particular, Ken has done a good deal of traveling and interviewing and researching the history of Christian education. Rehearsing and pondering our history is part of our training as stewards. This talk pairs a bit of vision with a lot of story. Stories of resistance and confusion, stories of respectful appeal and patient suffering, leading to such things as the transformation of a blue-eyed, blonde-haired volcano of a lady. She would sit at meetings, blowing smoke in the faces of the Amish school leaders. She was on the board of a public education board and a key player standing in the way of church schools. Listen on to hear how that changed. Christian Light hopes to one day publish these stories in a book. Till then, Ken is taking opportunity to tell the stories. How strong is your conviction for Christian education? Is it primarily motivated by what you reject or by what you aspire to? Is your vision propelled by preservation, rejection, or aspiration? Ken ponders these questions before launching into the storytelling. He offers 4 things that he wants to highlight with these stories. 1, God's strong hand, especially evident when God's people are in obedience. 2, respectful appeal compared to resistance. 3, the costliness of starting schools. And 4, giving honor where honor is due. Here's Ken.
1925 was a significant year for Christian education for several reasons. How many of you have ever heard of the Scopes monkey trial? This is when Mr. Scopes was put on trial in Dayton, Tennessee for teaching the theory of evolution. The state of Tennessee legislature had decided just prior to that it is illegal to teach anything that defies the history that the Bible says the way the world was created. And the ACLU or other organizations decided they're going to make a deal about this. And Dayton, Tennessee was chosen to be the location. And this was partly on account of merchants in the area inviting the trial to be held there because they wanted to make some money on this and publicize it heavily. And sure enough, during the trial, they made a lot of money. The town made a lot of money during this trial. It was called the Trial of the Century. It was the first one that was broadcast by radio all over the nation. And Mr. Scopes was put on trial because he volunteered to be just the guinea pig or the monkey for the trial. He had read one chapter in one book that reviewed Darwin's history of education to his students. And that qualified him for teaching the theory of evolution. And so he got put on trial. The trial lasted for I forget how long, but it was a number of days. And the theme ended up becoming monkeys. All right, so the town of Dayton was full of vendors hawking everything about monkeys. Stuffed monkeys, monkey fizz, ice cream, and just all kinds of stuff about monkeys. All right, because the whole question centered on, did man come from monkeys? Did humans derive from monkeys? And so the battle of evolution was on. Mr. Scopes was found guilty, actually, by the jury, because it was a straightforward decision. The law had been made. He had violated the law. He was found guilty. But you know who wanted him to be found guilty? The people that wanted to promote evolution, because they wanted to raise awareness to this thing. And so this became a huge turning point in the history of schools, the history of public education particularly. And this was a turning point too for even Anabaptist schools or other church schools, because now suddenly there's another bug entered the picture besides other things that had been present already in the course of events there. Here is so this was a brilliant attorney, Clarence Darrow, and he was arguing with William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan was a politician. He was a Secretary of State for one of the presidents. I forget which one it was, but he was an ardent Christian. He really wanted to defend the Bible. But when he got put on the stand, it became a vigorous back and forth between the two lawyers about the legitimacy of the Bible. That's what it ended up becoming. Here is a famous snippet of what was being discussed in that trial. Clarence Darrow, the evolutionary scientist attorney, said, asked Mr. Bryan, when Mr. Bryan was actually on the witness stand, he actually asked the prosecuting attorney to be his witness. So it was really a monkey trial. It was really back and forth. He asked him, what do you think that the Bible itself says? Do you know how that estimate of the year of the flood occurred and how it was arrived at? Bryan says, I've never made a calculation. A calculation from what? I could not say. From the generations of man? I would not want to say that. What do you think? I could not say. From the generations of man? I would not want to say that. What do you think? I did not think about things I don't think about. Do you think about things that you do think about? Well, sometimes. Actually, in the trial, neither one of the attorneys was made out to be a monkey. I mean, it was a fair trial. It was really a fair trial. The judge ruled significantly on William Jennings Bryan's account, and he was found guilty. He was fined $100. Mr. Scopes was fined $100 and let go. William Jennings Bryan died 5 days later from a heart attack. But the tide had turned. Public, especially in urban environments, city environments, people were becoming more and more convinced about the history of evolutionary thought and process. And then this was also a huge rise in fundamentalist approach, where we had people, even women preachers, going to the pulpit and railing for the Bible and just pounding the pulpits and going for it and say we have to believe the Bible's account and that kind of thing. So it was a polarizing, it had the intended effect of polarizing the public into these two camps. Interestingly enough, another significant event occurred in 1925, 100 years ago, and that was the first Amish school was founded in Apple Grove, Delaware. Arguably, this could be the first Mennonite school as well, which, if it's a Mennonite church school. We do know that there was there were schools that Mennonites attended long before that, even back in Christopher Dock's day, way back then. But as far as having a church school where a church or a congregation actually established a school to operate on its own, we do know that this was the first Amish one. Arguably, some people would argue that it was also the first Mennonite school of its kind. Okay, so we have these two events significant from the beginning. The reason that Amish school was started there in Dover, Delaware area was because of the consolidation that was going on. Consolidation, schools were being joined together, made into bigger environments where they could be more efficient supposedly, and were often moving into the cities. The Amish in that area had the forethought to think ahead and decide what is best for their students. And they came up with the first Amish school in Dover, Delaware area. So that brings us now to our subject, Anabaptist Christian schools. It is a suffering history. I'm going to jump around to some various different things here, and we'll end up in Nebraska today. But the past is a present. Steward it well. I'd like to challenge us to really consider the truth of this. The past, our history, is a present to us, and we should steward it well. If we don't steward it well, if we don't understand what we've been given, and we don't understand the price that has been paid, we're never going to appreciate it well enough to pass it on either. And this is one of my burdens in doing all of this, is to examine, to appreciate, and firm up our conviction for Christian education. We need to steward our past well. It is a present. And I'd like to ask you, is your conviction for Christian education informed mostly by what you don't want or by what we want? By what we reject or by what we aspire to? You see, there can be lots of different motives for actually having and starting and running our own schools. Is it because we just don't want to be picked up by our children to be picked up by that big yellow bus every morning and taken to, by what we don't want? Or is it by what we want? What is the most sufficient motive? What will carry us forward? What we want or by what we don't want? By what we reject or by what we aspire to? You could consider it this way. Put some percentages on the blanks. So you can have a vision that is propelled by preservation. We want to keep what we have. You can have a vision that is propelled primarily by rejection, by what we don't want. We know what we don't want. We're not sure what we want, but we sure know what we don't want. All right? Or we can have a vision that is propelled by aspiration, by what we really want. What is our desire? And can we formulate direction from aspiration? So, what would you suggest? Any suggestions for how much should belong on preservation? Any suggestions? What percentage of our motivation in our modus operandi, our mode of operation, what percentage of that could be based on preservation? I've had a lot of different ideas already, so you won't go wrong. If we'd say 10%, would that be realistic, or 0%? I mean, does it all have to be something better than that? Well, there is something to preservation, isn't it? What we want, what we have, preserving what we have and what God has blessed us with. So there's certainly some of that being present. And of course, there's some of what we don't want as well. But I think the highest percentage by far should be what we aspire to. And if we can formulate, verbalize, and even write down what we want, that can be an abiding and forceful, compelling cause for carrying it forward. And some of the accounts that I gathered were very strong in this way. They studied the scriptures. They came together. They formulated even a school handbook or a vision for the future before the school was even formed. This is what drove them forward. Others were much more motivated by preservation. Want to just keep what we have. Some others were really motivated by rejection of what was given to them or what they were facing. In this study, I'd like to state 4 objectives. Well, number 1 is I'd like for us to see God's strong hand. When God's people are faithful and trust Him in obedience, His hand is strong. He can come forward with a strong hand. I'd like to also highlight respectful appeal versus resistance. We say we're a non-resistant people. How often do we resist government, laws? That's the way we operate. That we just resist. Is that non-resistant or is that resistant? So versus respectful appeal. I'd like to also highlight that these privileges, these schools that were established that we'll be talking about, it isn't free and it wasn't cheap. It cost. It was very costly for a lot of these people. Then I want to give honor to whom honor is due for a few of the people that that maybe have not been heard of, or maybe not have been raised high on our pedestals of affirmation or appreciation, but they deserve it. They deserve to be recognized. We want to give honor to whom honor is due. So in this time, we will now go to Iowa in the Kelowna area and also the Buchanan County, Iowa area. And this came as a result of interviewing Glenn Bender in Auburn, Nebraska in 2020. He was 79 years old. He has passed away since. Some of you know him. How many of you knew Glenn Bender? Of course you did. I know you did. That was your grandpa? Yeah, that's right. So Glenn Bender, this is one thing he said to me when I asked him, what are some takeaways from how should we respond to Christian education today? And this is what he said: let's not be careless or indifferent about this. I thought that was noteworthy. How many of you have seen or heard of this story? Okay, most of you probably. Yeah, Run for the Cornfield. That instruction was given by Aidan Yutzi on November 1965 in Buchanan County, Iowa. In Iowa, Amish had established and funded their own schools all the way back in 1948. But they began receiving funds, particularly in Buchanan County, they're receiving funds from the state in 1961, and they also had their own English teachers in the schools by 1961. Conflict brewed from that point on. Coming back to Aidan Yutzi, who is the father that said, "Spring a foot of Elschkenfeld." Coming back to him, he was also then a co-defendant in Wisconsin versus Yoder. How many of you heard of that case that went to the Supreme Court of the United States? Yeah, Aidan Yutzi was the second named defendant in that case. He moved from Buchanan County, Iowa to New Glarus, Wisconsin, and then he was one of the fathers that was chosen to be part of the case there in the Wisconsin versus Yoder Supreme Court case. I interviewed Mrs. Yutzi, and I asked her, why Aidan? Why does he have to be so prominent in Buchanan County, Iowa, and then again in New Glarus, Wisconsin, and all the way to the Supreme Court? And she just kind of nodded her head and grinned and said, because Aidan was good with words. And now we do know that his silent partner, Jonas Yoder, was really quiet. He was quite a very quiet man. And so I think Aidan ended up being more or less the spokesperson for the three that were called to Wisconsin on that case. So he was quite influential in some of this. Now, at the same time here in Buchanan County, Iowa, past the 1965 occurrence where they had to run for the cornfield when the school buses were coming to pick them up to take them to the city schools, they had a deal with the superintendent. And I'm going to be reading some things here from the book that some of their citizens wrote recently. They made a deal with the superintendent of schools that if they would vote for him in the next public election, that he will then give them the rights to remain their own school, rather than going with what the state wanted them to do. Okay, so Hazleton, Iowa's two Amish schools had once been public up until 1947, and now, according to Johnson, the new board could reincorporate them into the public school system by leasing the buildings for a nominal fee, providing 2 certified teachers at public expense, and adapting the curriculum to the conviction of the Amish leaders. The fiscal advantages for the plain people would be considerable, and they would lose practically nothing in the process. This would now be considered a private school. So this is what they were being offered if they would vote for this certain superintendent. And so they were offered that, and they resisted for a while. They resisted the idea for a while, but they kept putting the pressure on, and finally the Amish went to the polls. Amish men went to the polls, and this superintendent was elected. But what happened is that the Hazeltonians, who were not Amish and had opposed reorganization, were furious about this behind-the-scenes compact and the role of the Amish in the referendum. And it ended up being a significant polarization. The public did not trust the Amish anymore. The vote was close. 264 votes for reorganization, while 215 were opposed. It was obvious that the 44 Amish men who voted in the Hazleton district had cast the deciding ballots. It's very obvious that they had cast the votes that carried it forward that way. But they lost the respect of the Amish, and the superintendent died before he even took office. And then so when they tried to make a deal, the same deal, recurring deal with the incoming superintendent, he said, it wasn't my deal. But here they were, back to base one. They could not even activate what they had agreed to do. And there was a lot of other things going on there. The state had already come in. They were in constant struggle with the state. The state was complaining. The state agencies, education agencies were complaining that these Amish don't talk. They don't come meet us. They just resist us. They just stiff arm us. They don't even engage in conversations. They just resist us all the way through. Their testimony was not great either. Their testimony was quite faulty and very, very sad, the testimony that they had in the area. But this resulted in, with their stiff arming, with their resistance to the state officials, it resulted in fines, jailings, and in general, just a really, really rough time for the community. Fathers were jailed for not sending their children to the school, and there was a lot of other things going on there. And then also, the state forced them to take an achievement test. Results were dismal. Does the state have an interest in the children in the state receiving a good education? Should the state have an interest in that? I think they should. And they were alarmed. The state was alarmed, and it kept polarizing the issue harder and harder and harder because of that. Now, over in Kelowna, Iowa, almost due south of Buchanan County, they started with their own schools at nearly the same time. But they were staffed by their own teachers. They were not taking public funds, and they kept a wary eye on what was happening in Buchanan County. These Amish in Kelowna, Iowa, were not friendly. At least they would not share their own, they were not pulpit friendly, Amish communities. They would not share pulpits with each other. But they realized that this is coming down to the wire. We're going to have to make a decision. Are we going to persist in this, or are we going to go ahead and take the advantage step and negotiate directly with the state officials? And that's what they chose to do. Glenn Bender was a 27-year-old Amish bishop when he was put on the committee that was elected to go talk to the state officials about having and running their own schools. And along with about 3 or 4 other men, they made some trips back and forth, and it ended up being a 2 or 3 year process before it was finally resolved. But 3 times they went to the state capitol, Des Moines, to meet with individual legislators. They met with Mr. Vetter, state legislator, who said, "You people are the salt of the earth. I'm going to do everything I can to accommodate you." They went to the state capitol. They visited the state capitol just to be able to hopefully connect with state legislators and congressmen. They met with the governor. They met with Governor Ray. And Governor Ray was a religious man. He was very knowledgeable about the Bible and history, biblical history and that kind of thing. And he was really interested in their history. And they gave them their story. We came over to this country seeking religious freedom. We were granted religious freedom in Pennsylvania. And he questioned them, he examined their witness, and his pledge was, I will do everything I can to accommodate you folks. They also met with the State Board of Public Education. This was the decision-making body. And prior to this time, partly because of their engagement with the Buchanan County Amish, originally they had voted against giving the Amish the right to have their own schools. And it was a 5-4 decision against the right to have their own schools. Particularly interesting was Mrs. Cole. She was one of the State Board of Education, Public Instruction, who had voted against the Amish because she had had some interesting engagements with the people in Buchanan County. She was also a chain smoker. And back in those days, you could have public meetings in the state capitol, and the air would be blue with smoke. And so here she was, sitting across the table from these 4 or 5 different Amish and Mennonite men, and she was blowing smoke in their faces. She huff and puff, blow smoke right in their faces. The news people that were standing behind there, they were shaking their heads, just, how can this be? But she was obviously against the Amish. She was strong-willed, very strong and forceful. Glenn Bender called her a blue-eyed, blonde-haired volcano. But she was seated closely to T.J. Miller. T.J. Miller was one of the representatives from the committee, and T.J. had a very mild and gentle response to her persecution that she was giving him. He would just chuckle very quietly and politely and say, thank you, we understand. Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, yeah. Glenn Bender actually took the privilege of talking to her on the side after the meeting and said, well, we appreciate that we now know where you stand. Thank you for being so honest and forthright. So they were very respectful and affirming of these people. The next step was after they met with the State Board of Public Education, the State Board of Education contacted these brethren in Kelowna and said, would you be willing to go to Buchanan County, talk with them? They quivered in their shoes, but they went. They went to talk with them. I'm not sure that there was a direct response about that was favorable, but they at least talked to them about, you should have your own schools with your own teachers and quit taking the public funds. Those were kind of the things that they focused on. And then T.J. Miller, who was a fairly well-set businessman, farmer, and a businessman in the area, he made contact with Governor Ray himself and invited him to come to Kelowna and visit them. Come to his farm, visit the farms in the area, visit the schools in the area, and he came. There was an entourage of about 100 people, including a bunch of the state police and a number of other legislators and people that were interested in this. They visited the schools, they went to their farms, they had a big Amish meal made for them, and they were quite favorably impressed. When they visited the schools, the school teacher met them at the door. She started singing a song for the governor, and the song was a president's song sung to the tune of Yankee Doodle. Again, needless to say, Governor Ray was quite impressed. It says here that he tours Amish schools and he sticks to his exemption stand. He wanted those people to be exempt from the requirements of the state. They had an opportunity to bring the subject back up again with the State Board of Public Education. During that visit, Glenn Bender himself asked the committee if they know anything about the preamble to the Constitution, if they could quote it for him. And all of them said, no, we can't do it. So he started off. He quoted the whole preamble to the Constitution by memory to these officials. Guess what kind of impression that gave them officials? They were educated. That's what it told them, that they were educated, sufficiently educated, even in the preamble to the Constitution, and where all men are created equal, and those kind of things like that. And in the process, they gained their respect. Their students had also taken the Iowa test of basic skills and had passed remarkably nice. I mean, just very, very good education was obvious through this. 3 of the men on the committee took the GED also. Glenn himself, at 27, 28, 29 years old, however old he was during that time, came out showing he had the equivalent of 2 years of college education. These people were impressed. Glenn asked them, at one point he said that Romans 13 says that you people are God's agents to us, for us. Because of the government, because of our government, we can rest easy at night. You do not bear the sword in vain. We recognize that. We owe you respect and obedience as far as we conscientiously can. But we can do that better if you let us have our own schools. That was the kind of appeal he had to the government, and the State Board of Public Instruction. Soon after that, the State Board of Public Instruction met again and re-voted on the subject. This time it passed 6-3 for exemption. Do you know who led the way? Mrs. Cole, the blue-eyed, blonde-haired volcano, urged the other members of the committee to say, not all the Amish are alike. They need to have their own schools. And so this passed because of the witness of the Kelowna Amish. Okay, now we'll go to Nebraska, and here we meet Dave Berkey. Dave Berkey still lives today. He is a retired bishop in the community there in Beaver Crossing, and Wayne Troyer is on the right. He was the man that was called into court for his children being truant. He was the representative for all the parents in the school there. The background for this was Jimmy Carter running for president, 1976. In 1976, Jimmy Carter ran for president, and one of his platforms was born again. I'm a born again Christian. You need to vote for me. And this really carried, and there's a whole groundswell of appreciation for the born again movement, kind of. And this resulted in schools being established, Christian schools being established all over the United States. And particularly on the heels of Accelerated Christian Education, ACE, they were at the forefront of this new kind of education, and Christian education in particular. And so it was easy to start up schools if you used their curriculum, and Alpha Omega, and eventually others came aboard as well. But this individualized way of schooling was easy to start a school, and many schools were started. But some of the states started noticing what was going on. So especially among the fundamentalist Baptist groups, there was a lot of things happening, and they were already in run-ins with the various states, particularly in Nebraska. Nebraska was particularly tough on their requirements for church schools. They would not allow it. They were not the teachers were not certified. You can't have a school unless you're certified by the state, and everything is okay like this. This is Dr. Everett Sullivan, and he was kind of the keystone or the focal point of much of the conflict in the state of Nebraska. He owned a school, he ran a school and was using the ACE curriculum and method of instruction, and he was particularly independent. He was what they call here fiercely independent, and he was resisting, very much demanding their rights. And he was kind of like the polarizing. He was kind of like the leader of a lot of the schools in the area or even in the region. And it came to the point where people from, and the state started paying a lot of attention to him, and it was not the kind of attention he liked, and they were threatening to shut him down. Eventually they did. They dragged the people out of the school, the staff that were still there, they dragged them out of school and chained and padlocked the doors in their school there. But a lot of it was because of his reaction. So by this time, even the President Ronald Reagan had noticed. They had some notice about all this upheaval in the state of Nebraska. And Elizabeth Dole, who was the first Secretary of Education was under President Reagan, her secretary drafted this thing here, this letter, about the president is headed into a hornet's nest on Wednesday when he is scheduled to speak in Lincoln, Nebraska on behalf of Governor Thone. Governor Thone was sympathetic to Dr. Everett Sullivan. Reverend Everett Sullivan is what they called him. But there will probably be more than 1,000 pastors there from all around the country and in the area demonstrating support for Sullivan. And down in the bottom, the last paragraph, they liken the situation to a powder keg. And he says the preachers involved don't cuss, but they wish they could. He also has reported from Chuck O'Malley that some outraged locals are talking about firearms and saying they won't be pushed around anymore. Law enforcement was really on high alert from some of this by Christians. And they actually stopped vehicles from coming into the area and searched vehicles, and there was a lot of firearms coming into the region as well. Well, I don't think President Reagan actually attended then. I think he sent somebody else in his stead. But this was how engaged the whole nation was with this dilemma. In the meantime, in Beaver Crossing, Nebraska, concerned members from the East Fairview Mennonite Church contemplated opening their own school. West Fairview Mennonite Church also considered it and decided against it. At first, the group wanted to do everything legally, and they made contacts. They tried to see how legal they could be. But when it wasn't possible, they considered the depth of their convictions on Christian education and decided to proceed anyway. They studied the scriptures. They banded together. They drafted the purpose of our school before it was even established. They drafted this. They took notes. They studied diligently, and all throughout this time, a lot of scripture, a lot of studying, a lot of prayer, a lot of banding together. They had a forward look. They knew what they wanted. They decided to pay the cost. There was no turning back if they decided to move forward. That's one thing they had decided in advance, that if we decide to move ahead anyway, there's no turning back. We're going to continue regardless of the cost. They purchased a school building, and Faith Christian School was established as a nonprofit 501c3 entity soon afterwards. David Berkey, age 24, was asked to be the administrator of the school. His bishop was not at all favorable to the idea and did not support his views or his role in starting the school against state law. Ended up that David, for that reason, left with his family, left the church, and went to Faith Christian Fellowship, which was started by other disaffected members of the two Mennonite churches in the area. When the local superintendent came out to inspect the school, he commented on the happy students and seemed personally not to have a problem with the school operating. But when his report went to the state, the Attorney General instructed county attorneys to begin to prosecute the truant students. At first, the court prosecuted the school because of the uncertified teachers and administrators. The two teachers were advised to pack their suitcases because they could land in jail that night. It did not happen. The reason? They got their achievement test done just prior to this. And their achievement test resulted in very, very high scores. And they didn't have anything to charge them with because a certified teacher wouldn't have made any difference anyway. So they was kind of nixed in the bud. But the state moved them to charge them with truancy by neglect. So the parents were charged with neglect because their children were truant. And parental neglect was a serious, and is still a very serious charge. 25 Seward County children were charged with truancy. Their parents were charged with neglect. One of the first things that the patrons, the school did, is they went to the state capitol. They just made a friendly visit to see if they could talk to state legislators and just to explain their situation to them. Why are we doing what we're doing? We're not like Everett Sullivan. We're not going to be insisting on our rights. We respectfully appeal to you to consider and hear us, hear our case. That was what they wanted to convey to them. And it seemed like it paid off, because by this time Christian Law Association was involved, and they were helping Dr. Everett Sullivan. When they heard that there was this little Mennonite community starting up in Beaver Crossing, Nebraska, starting a school, they came to them and offered their services to them, and eventually chose to make them the forefront of all the activity with the state. One of the first things they did is tell them that we're not going to countersue. They said, what? We're not going to sue? Well, how can we have a case? Well, they said, we're not going to sue. We're not going to sue. They decided to keep the case and brought them to the forefront of the case. In doing so, they asked David, 24 years old, to be their contact with the state legislators to help draft laws that could be friendly. So they had decided, first of all, that there is no legal recourse for the school, because you could not operate the school legally. But if you could change the law through legislature, that would make the point moot. That would also keep them from having to have the trial and go on with that. So their objective, their strategy was to continue delaying the trial. So there would be hearings upon hearings upon hearings, and every trial would be continued, to be continued, to be continued, to be continued. All the while, Dave Berkey and some of the Baptist preachers and other people were working in the state capitol, working with the education officials and lawmakers, developing relationships. Dave Berkey especially was really keen on building relationships with these people. He estimates that he spent about 1,000 hours in the state capitol in the next 4 or 5 years, working with legislators and talking with them, working with the attorneys from Christian Law Association. He made many trips to Lincoln to visit with and speak to many influential people, not the least being the head lobbyist for the Nebraska State Education Association, which was a chapter of the Federal State Education Association. After a number of bills that friendly legislators had fashioned and drafted were defeated, it seemed like there would be enough votes. They felt like they had enough votes for this language of this law to be passed. It would be shot down at the last minute. The culprit was Herb Schimek, this lobbyist with the Nebraska State Education Association. He was a big man. Dave described him as saying he was like a big fullback in a football field. And he was vicious. Christian Law Association called me one day and they said, Dave, why don't you just go and talk to Herb Schimek? Oh man, I didn't want to go to talk to him, Dave said. He is vicious, and he was. But I eventually decided, okay, I will go. So I went to him. I said, Herb, I would like to talk with you. And he asked, well, what do you want? I said, I just want to talk with you, Dave. And he said, all right. So we met at 6 o'clock in the morning. Many of their meetings, often their meetings were under the cover of darkness, real early in the morning or late in the evening so that they wouldn't have the media there. They met at 6 o'clock in the morning. Dave sat down with Herb Schimek in the restaurant in the Capitol building. And we sat down. He always called me Berkey. Okay, Berkey, what do you want? Big, bold voice. He was so harsh. Oh, he didn't mince any words. And I said, you know, Herb, we're not your enemy. And we're really not even a threat to you. And I went on to present my case. All we want to do is to be left alone so we can practice our faith. Herb, why? Why do you see me as such an enemy? He refused to answer me. Finally, he said, okay, what do you want me to do? And I said, Herb, all I think you ought to do is just call the dogs off. Just take a walk when it's time for this vote. He must have done so because the bill passed. With this victory in hand, David went to talk with the governor, Bob Carey, whom he had befriended. On his way to the governor had just come out of the office to meet him, to go find him, and they both met in the hallway, and they said, Governor Carey said, "We did it, Dave." We? This was a liberal Democratic governor who was elected, much to the dismay of many of these fundamentalist Baptist church leaders and coalitions that were lobbying for the right to have their own schools. They had wrung their hands when this governor was elected and wondering, what are we going to do now? And Dave challenged them to consider that this is not limiting God's hand of deliverance. What if deliverance will come to this man through this man? God was able to use wicked King Cyrus to restore his people to a good place. He can do this through this man also. That's what happened. The case had national repercussions, and there was a lot of attention given to it, along with a good bit of tension and political polarization. In the meantime, Faith Christian School continued to operate and was able to demonstrate with achievement testing that students were doing very well in basic skills. Finally, the methodology rules were passed, which governed and prescribed how private and church schools could operate, and that governing document is still active today. Dave Berkey was instrumental in drafting that governing document for how schools could operate in the state. Nebraskans and many other people owe a debt of gratitude to Dave Berkey and Nelson Troyer, who was with his son on the witness stand a number of times while the case was being continued. After this issue was resolved through the legislature, Dave returned to the church, and the bishop extended a hand of welcome. He was eventually ordained to the ministry and later to the bishop role. I'm going to share just a couple of noteworthy accounts. Ann Campbell was the commissioner of education. She was an in-charge type of lady. David says he doesn't remember why he had the gall to do this, but she was sitting in a meeting on one side of the table when he was on the other side. In the course of conversation, she started beating on the table saying, "I'm telling you, education is the answer for all the woes in our country." And I beat back on the table and I said, "I tell you, education will never answer the failures of the human heart." And that is the issue. That is why we need Christian schools. Dave also recounted how there was a significant effort to try to get the conservatives out to vote. He says, "I remember sitting in a pastor's meeting with the governor where they were talking about getting out and getting the vote. They looked at me and said, 'Well, what are you going to do with your people?' I mentioned that we had already been to the legislature. And then I said, 'Our frame of mind is to go by way of respectful appeal like Daniel did, rather than to vote.' And they said, 'You mean you don't vote?' I said, 'No, we do not vote.' 'You pay taxes, but you don't vote?' 'Yes, that's correct.' You know, that was a new concept to those people. And finally, you remember Herb Scheimek? They did not become friends because of this. Not at all. Herb lost a lot when that law was passed. One time I saw in the paper that Herb Scheimek had cancer. I told my wife, I'm going down and I'm going to visit him. I knew he didn't like me, but I went in anyway. When he saw who I was, he rolled over and turned his back to me, his face to the wall. I walked up to his bed and I said to his back, "Herb, I'm here because I care. I want to know if it's okay if I have prayer with you." Herb was a Catholic, but he did grunt and say, "Yeah, go ahead." So I had prayer with him and I left. Sometime later, we were caroling down at the Omaha Mall. This was after I had come back to my original church. We were done when I heard somebody holler my name, and I'm like, oh my goodness, who knows me down here in Omaha? It was Herb Scheimek. He came and threw his big old arms around me. And now Herb looks like he could have been a good fullback in his football days. He was a big dude. He put his big old arms around me and then he said, "I want you to meet my wife, Dave." I said, "Herb, I haven't seen you for a long time. How are you doing?" Dave's wife started going to a farmer's market down in Lincoln. Herb Schimek ended up visiting her quite often and buying angel food cakes every time he visited, and he always asked, "How's Dave doing?" The power of non-resistance. Non-resistance and respectful appeal is God's way. God's hand is strong when his people follow him in faith and obedience. Thank you for your interest in Anabaptist Christian education.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Doc School Leader Podcast. We hope that this episode contributes to your growth and renewal. If you're finding these episodes meaningful, consider leaving us a rating or share an episode with a friend. We'd also be glad to hear from you. You can get in contact with us through our website, www.thedocforlearning.org. Or you can complete our listener survey. See the show notes for both options. May God, who has called you to the labor of education, prosper your work and fulfill his goodwill through your school.